The Hague Group is a newly formed alliance of Global South nations taking action to uphold international law and to hold Israel accountable for its actions in Palestine. So will this new initiative lead to accountability for Israel? This week on UpFront, I'll be asking that question to Guillaume Long, the former Ecuadorian foreign minister who has been part of the Hague Group since its inception. Guillaume Long, thank you so much for joining me on UpFront.
No, thank you for having me on the show.
You are a top diplomatic advisor to the Hague Group, which is a coalition of Global South nations which was formed to pressure Israel to end its genocide in Gaza and, of course, to also uphold international law. The group is co-chaired by Colombia and South Africa, and it includes members such as Namibia, Bolivia, and Malaysia, among others. What steps are being taken to help the Hague Group achieve its goals?
Yeah, so the idea behind the Hague Group is that there is actually no lack of clarity in terms of legal norms, in terms of international law. But what I think the frustration that all the states that jointly launched the Hague Group shared is that a lot of this international law, a lot of these norms, a lot of these rules are not being applied. So you have these fantastic resolutions that are voted in multilateral spheres in the UN General Assembly last year. A very important UN resolution was voted by 124 states in September of last year, which is actually very, strong. It really establishes strong obligations for states to comply with. And yet, I speak to my colleagues in the halls of the UN or former colleagues or whatever, and they're all extremely frustrated at the moment that all their work basically leads to nothing. There are no consequences. International law is not enforced. And so the idea behind the Hague Group is very young. It was created in January, was to really create a group of states that would commit themselves to comply with their obligations under international law, to take specific measures, not call for, not denounce, not condemn, but actually enforce international laws through measures. And so the measures of the Hague Group, now we've had some new measures because there was a big conference in Bogota of the Hague Group with 31 states attending. But broadly speaking, it's about arms embargo, it's about stopping ships from docking in the countries that join the Hague Group, that carry weapons or other armament or dual use, things that are going to be participate in the massacre and the genocide currently taking place in Gaza, to stop those ships from materially reaching Israel. And of course the issue as well of shipping, deflagging vessels that are participating in providing weapons to Israel. There are other measures such as public investment and public procurement. A lot of states are still investing in corporations that are guilty of participating in the Israeli genocide. There are a number of measures that have been taken forward. There's also measures that have to do with accountability.
How powerful are these measures? I mean, we're talking about Global South nations, which collectively obviously comprise a big power block, but against the backdrop of major nations that are doing the opposite. They are vetoing resolutions. They are reinforcing their commitments to Israel. How effective can a coalition of Global South nations be when so many others in the Global North are not doing the same?
Well, I think it's an important first step, right? When you have 31 states saying we're going to enforce measures to stop the genocide, to hold the genocide, it's an important signal for others to join. It's important to say that we've kind of broken this Global South, Global North divide. So now we have a number of European states that are attending the meetings that are being convened by the Hague Group. So countries like Spain, like Norway, Slovenia, Ireland, hopefully Iceland this week, maybe even Malta. A number of European states are starting to take measures. Spain is a good example. Spain, for example, is taking a number of the measures, not formally a member of the Hague Group. It's joining some of the meetings and the discussions.
It's Hague adjacent.
It's adjacent to the Hague Group. But Spain has actually taken a lot of the measures that Hague Group countries have taken. So it's actually blocking its ports from ships that are carrying weapons to Israel to dock in its sovereign territory. It's now got an arms embargo enforced. So, it's not just the Global South, which is important because I think more and more nations now are feeling that if they don't enforce measures, first of all, they're in violation of their own commitments under international law, and secondly, they run the risk of being complicit in a genocide. And let's not forget that the Genocide Convention is not just about the country committing the genocide, it's also about third state parties that can be complicit in the committal of genocide. So I think we're seeing a bit of a snowball effect with more and more countries joining in these measures. I think it's important because, you know, there's a lot of talk and not enough action.
You talked about international law, and as you've suggested, international law is only as valuable as its enforcement by the global community.
Right.
Well, right now, it doesn't seem to be much of that happening. The ICC's arrest warrants, to give an example, for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, have faced strong pushback from multiple nations around the world. Donald Trump, the U.S. president, has sanctioned court officials for its decision. Hungary says it won't be enforcing ICC rulings. France even questions the validity of the rulings. With major powers like that resisting, how realistic is it for the Hague Group to, again, uphold international law as a matter of practice?
I mean, ultimately, this is all about collective action. If you have states individually doing things by themselves in an isolated manner, in a fragmented manner, they are less likely to succeed because, you know, united we stand with a stronger voice, but they're also more likely to be bullied, they're more likely to be punished. So the idea, again, behind the Hague Group is to create, very much in the way that you had groups of countries standing against apartheid in South Africa in the 1970s and 1980s. So it's about recreating this collective action, this coordinated action, to both be more effective in terms of getting, you know, actions implemented, getting measures enforced, but also resisting punishment. And you just mentioned, you know, sanctions against now UN special rapporteurs, for example, which had never really happened before. The United States is now sanctioning UN officials. Sanctions against the International Criminal Court, against the ICC and its judges, threatening to sanction states and diplomats. And the only way we can push back against that is through creating coalitions, groups of states. We will stand together because otherwise, you know, states are ripe for the picking, divide and rule, race to the bottom, all these kinds of things are more likely to happen.
And part of that happening is not just that the big states are reluctant to criticize Israel, it's that they're selectively enforcing international law against other nations. I mean, people have often sort of perversely joked that the ICC is the ACC, the African Criminal Court.
Absolutely.
You know, how does that play into the logics of the Hague Group in terms of thinking about not just we need to hold Israel accountable, but we also have to keep some kind of balance here in terms of who gets selected for accountability?
Absolutely. The world is full of double standards, and countries act, particularly great powers, act in a very selective way, in a very arbitrary way. When we created the Hague Group in January, actually it was when Trump was coming into power and when he was threatening the ICC with sanctions, and when a number of European leaders were saying, yeah, we would arrest Putin, but Netanyahu we wouldn't. How does that work, right? I mean, if you're members, if you're party to the Rome Statute, then it applies to everyone, right? So those kinds of double standards are the ones that the members of the Hague Group, and in fact, the measure number one of the Hague Group launch in January was to serve the arrest warrants against Benjamin Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant, as the ICC has requested. So it has been also, and the Hague Group is many things. It's obviously first and foremost a group to put an end to the genocide, but it's also indirectly a group that is calling for, you know, international law, multilateralism, the end of these double standards. And, you know, if we're going to have international law, if we're going to vote for international law, if we're going to have the ICJ advisory opinion and the UN General Assembly's resolution of September last year, then let's enforce them. Otherwise, there's no point in having. There's a lot of coverage of all these decisions that are made, but then there's very little follow-up. And in practice, this is what the Hague Group is trying to correct. Yeah.
Does the Hague Group get formed if Joe Biden is still president?
I mean, I think ultimately yes, because I think under Joe Biden, U.S. policy wasn't actually fundamentally that different towards Gaza than it has been under Trump. Trump is more bombastic. Trump is uses less leverages of diplomacy. So, for example, this sanctioning that we're seeing all over the place is probably something more akin to the Trump administration, to the Biden administration. But ultimately, the Biden administration was giving Israel a get out of jail card for all of the crimes that Israel was committing. It's not as if the Biden administration was pushing back against the genocide in Gaza. It was not. The genocide in Gaza, half of the deaths, actually more than half of the deaths that happened in Gaza happened under Joe Biden's watch. So I think the Hague Group, in fact, it was the idea for the Hague Group started under Biden, it then materialized under Trump.
You, of course, served as Foreign Minister of Ecuador under President Rafael Correa from 2016 to 2017. We're seeing a renewed debate now about how the global order is shifting. Leaders like President Lula da Silva of Brazil talk about a multipolar world, one that gives the region its own voice, one that is independent of Washington. But at the same time, the Trump administration has taken an increasingly heavy-handed posture against Latin America. I'm talking about deadly attacks, sanctions, pressure on the judicial systems of particular countries. Can the region really carve out a more independent role in the world, particularly given these circumstances?
I think the dawn of a multipolar order is a good thing for the world, for sure. Unipolarity was a bad thing, and the redistribution, transformation of the world system and the redistribution of power to a greater amount of actors is a good thing, right? Redistributing power, not centralizing power in one single actor, but having a redistribution of global power is, of course, a good thing and a democratizing thing for the international system. But I think it's important that we shouldn't confuse multipolarity with multilateralism. They're different things, yeah? So multipolarity is several powers. Multilateralism is actually rule of law. It's, the idea of a UN General Assembly, a parliament, where every state has the same importance, the same rights, the same decision-making power. So multipolarity is good, but it's a vehicle for what I would call multilateralism. I really believe in multilateralism because, in Latin America, you could have, for example, multipolarity, and yet a Latin America that's completely under US hegemony. Those things are not incompatible. Let's say one of the powers, which is very likely that the United States continues to be a great global power. One of the powers is the United States, and therefore, its sphere of influence is the Western Hemisphere, for example. That doesn't make the world a better place for Latin American nations. They're going to be under US hegemony. So I think it's important to qualify what multipolarity is. Yes, it's better to have a greater group of powerful players in the system. It also means that weaker states have more bargaining power. They can resort to different powers and are not completely under the domination of a single entity. But I really think it's important to think beyond multipolarity and continue defending multilateralism, rules, institutions, norms that protect the weakest members of our international community.
Do we have the wrong goal?
Of the abuses of the more powerful actors in our international community.
Do we have the wrong goal now? Are we looking too much toward multipolarity without creating the conditions for multilateralism? Yeah,
I'm afraid that multipolarity can lead to a very sort of fragmented world order with spheres of influence. So there's a Chinese sphere of influence, there's a Russian sphere of influence, a European sphere of influence, there's a US sphere of influence. I think that can be a potential risk. I mean, one way that Latin America, which was your question centered on Latin America, could benefit from multipolarity is if actually Latin America created regionalism, as in regional integration, regional bodies that create sort of bloc coalition logic for Latin America. And we had that under what often Anglo-Saxons called the pink tide, where you had a wave of progressive governments in Latin America trying to be more sovereign, defend their sovereignty, because, with the long history of US intervention in the region and coups and all these kinds of things, Latin American countries, roughly between 2000 and 2015, for a decade and a half, created regional institutions, such as CELAC, such as UNASUR, the Union of South American Nations. And so there, that enables you to stop these divide and rule logic with the United States, to stand sort of in a cohesive fashion. It's not always going to be in unison, but in a cohesive fashion, and insert yourself in that multipolar logic you're talking about as a region, but with rules and with governance, with a system which again, within Latin America, you also have more powerful states. So you wouldn't want, for example, Brazil to be the almighty power in South America and the other countries to be vulnerable to Brazil's abuse of power. I'm not saying Brazil wants to abuse power, but you wouldn't want that logic either. So creating regional multilateralism within a multipolar logic, I think, is one of the ways forward. I mean, certainly multipolarity is a positive step, but what I'm saying is not enough in itself.
Absolutely.
It's not the end game.
And you mentioned Brazil. I'm thinking about the BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, among others. They're starting to call for at least multipolarity. And Washington is pushing back, which isn't surprising, but it's still important to think about. I mean, Trump advisor, for example, Steve Bannon stated, "You can tell the president is pissed every time he looks at the BRICS de-dollarization effort." How do you see this confrontation between Washington and the BRICS playing out?
Yeah, I think essentially the BRICS, I mean, is a summit, it's a meeting of presidents, but it doesn't really yet have real teeth or institutions. I mean, the only thing that the BRICS has really consolidated that exists in the real world, aside from this summit logic of heads of state meeting and saying things together, the only institution that's built so far is this new development bank, which as yet has not been fully developed as a rival, if you like, to the IMF. We're not there yet. You know, maybe one day China and other countries decide they really want to capitalize the bank and they want it to compete with the IMF, but we're not there yet. So I would say right now the BRICS is more of a threat, and it's amazing how threatening it's been. You're right. I mean, a lot of Western leaders, including obviously US leaders, have been saying this is an anti-West bloc of states. I mean, it is a bloc of states that is saying, hey, we still have a world order that is the world order of 1945, with the five, permanent members of the UN Security Council, the five sort of nuclear powers. Now we have a few more, but the original five nuclear powers. And that doesn't represent the new world order in which we are. We have, and it was still a very colonial world order back then, and we need to change. And, it would be great if we could change from within and have a UN Security Council that transforms, and institutions that transforms, and an IMF that transforms, that not just based on quotas of states and the US having a veto in the IMF as it has, The US still has a veto in the IMF, the strongest financial institution in the world. So it's the BRICS saying it would be great if it transforms from within, but if it doesn't transform from within, well, maybe we could do our own thing. So it is kind of a threat which hasn't yet materialized and hasn't yet institutionalized. The BRICS is not a parallel UN system. BRICS is not yet a system of global governance. It's so far a group of states that are kind of complaining that Western-dominated governance is not reforming itself.
Right.
But BRICS is still saying things, not yet really doing things. Again, the exception is probably the BRICS Bank, the new development bank. But so far, it doesn't compete with the IMF, right? And for all the talks of de-dollarization, the world is still extremely dollarized, right? So you are seeing, yes, more and more initiatives of trade that's non-dollarized trade, but ultimately, both in terms of international reserves and in terms of the volume of trade, the world is still extremely dollarized. So I would say the BRICS is still very incipient. Post-Western mechanism. We're not yet at a stage where the BRICS represents a new world order.
Fair enough. You actually recently commented that one of the main dilemmas for global South countries, particularly ones facing U.S. pressure, is whether to be, quote, sovereign or to be submissive. That's a stark choice. When U.S. retaliation can mean sanctions, it can mean violence. We just saw the U.S. strikes against alleged drug smuggling vessels in the Caribbean. I mean, the stakes are pretty high. How do countries navigate that dilemma?
I think the only way that you can have sovereignty is through collective sovereignty. Yeah. On your own, I mean, it depends what country you are.
Collective sovereignty is an interesting phrase.
Yeah, collective sovereignty, the idea is that you, again, through collective action, you create internationalist logic. We used to call them non-alignment, for example, in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, after the Bandung movement of the 1950s, where countries band together and are able to be sovereign as individually sovereign, because they're individual states, but as a collective mechanism, right? So internationalism at the service of nationalism. In a kind of, there's a paradox there, right? You create, you cede sovereignty in order for a greater sovereignty to emerge, if you see what I mean.
Yeah.
So I really believe, again, the regional logic is one of them, having regional blocks that sort of stand together. But you could also have other types of country alliances. The Hague Group is a good example of that. In the old days, we had, export clubs and cartels and so on, so like OPEC. Today, you could potentially have a group of countries uniting a group of debtors club. I mean, you have a creditors club, the Paris Club. There are lots of creditors club around the world that say we want our money. You could have a group of debtors club that sort of increase their bargaining power by banding together, by creating coalitions. I think that's the only way you're really going to have a world order in which the more vulnerable actors are sovereign and not submissive. If it's just bilateralism, if it's just the US versus Haiti or the US versus Botswana or the US versus Laos, there's no, and this is what the US seeks. The US does not want these coalitions to form. The US does not want to be dealing with the CELAC or the UNASUR or the African Union or ASEAN. It wants to deal with individual states. And all of US foreign policy doctrine is about bilateralism. And it does, it goes really out of its way to make sure that it's dealing with countries on a one-per-one basis.
Of course, it's its own interest.
And so that's what Global South countries have to try and resist. That's the only way forward for these countries. Otherwise, the art of the deal is not going to favor them, right? The deal is just going to favor the United States, and they're going to be prey to bullying, tariffs, sanctions, and so on and so forth.
In recent weeks, the United States has carried out deadly strikes on Venezuelan vessels, alleging that they were engaging in narco-terrorism. That was their justification. Human Rights Watch said these strikes amounted to extrajudicial killings and a violation of international humanitarian law. The U.S. has also significantly bolstered its military presence in the Southern Caribbean, as I mentioned earlier. What do you make of these attacks, and is there a risk of further escalation?
So for sure, there's a risk of further escalation. It's a very, very dangerous situation that we're facing now in Latin America because of these attacks. And it seems to be, quite honestly, a deliberate provocation on behalf of the United States to try and provoke, to bait Venezuela into a war. It seems to me that this certainly isn't what President Trump offered the electorate. He promised no more wars and no more forever wars. So it seems to be very contradictory with the original Trump message. I'm seeing Secretary of State Rubio being very aggressive on this front. I think Rubio is both more ideological and sort of very interested in Latin America, very interested in the backyard, and probably I think he's one of the people that's responsible for this policy. And he's also very interested in Venezuela and Cuba, which he sees as going hand in hand.
Absolutely.
So it is a very dangerous situation. I think it's dangerous and irresponsible. We've seen what US sanctions did to Venezuela after 2017, and particularly after 2019. The US sanctions created an economic disaster for Venezuela, with Venezuela not being able to export its primary export, which is oil, and greatly impoverishing the Venezuelan economy, which then led to a massive migration crisis, which greatly and gravely affected the region. Numbers differ, but several million Venezuelans leaving Venezuela and migrating to Colombia, to Ecuador, to Peru, to Chile primarily, but also to the United States, which then kind of fed into also the Trump phenomenon.
Yeah.
And now, which is the paradox here, right? So you're creating a migratory crisis, which then benefits you electorally. It's really quite incredible. But if there was a war, and if there was a bombing campaign, a war in terms of ground troops is much less likely. Significantly, the United States has never physically invaded a South American country. It's physically invaded a lot of Central American and Caribbean countries in the kind of Caribbean backyard, but never in South America. They're larger states. It's a bit more distant. So ground troops, you would need the approval of Brazil and Colombia to play ball. They've already said that's a no-no. So I don't think that's likely. But you could have a scenario where you would, with a bombing campaign, with targeted bombing on stuff like that.
That seems to be the most likely scenario and the most concerning one, that the U.S. is just going to be carrying out strikes against, whoever they deem to be eligible, with no regard for international law, no regard for humanitarian standards.
seeking some kind of Libyan outcome as if that was a successful one, not creating a huge humanitarian crisis and migratory and refugee crisis. Yeah, I think this is, certainly there is no support in Latin America for this.
There's such a long history of this, you know, the war on drugs initiatives, the Merida initiative, Plan Colombia, which poured billions of dollars into militarization, didn't produce.
Yeah, it's really quite remarkable. The United States doesn't learn from its mistakes. I mean, war on drugs is one of the biggest failures, historic failures of US foreign policy.
Yeah.
We still have drugs. It's created...
And domestic policy.
Yeah, absolutely, and domestic policy. It's created untold suffering in Latin America, massive human rights violations. And, you know, it abated for a while. There was less talk of war on drugs, and now it's kind of, we're doubling down again on a war on drugs with the same old militarized strategy, the militarization, with kind of security cooperation with Latin American states, making those Latin American states more prone to human rights violations, more authoritarian, empowering the militaries within those states. It's really bad stuff. But also using it sort of as a way to, I mean, there's a cynical agenda here, I feel, because the war on drugs is enabling US intervention in the region, right?
Precisely.
So you're using, and the United States is using the war on drugs to justify its presence. And, you know, it's kind of all stick and no carrot, because ultimately, in terms of investment and economic engagement and trade, there's no real carrot. In fact, the other way around, the United States is imposing tariffs left, right, and center on a number of countries. And it's not as if there's a massive US Marshall Plan style, you know, or even Kennedy's Alliance for Progress, we're going to, you know, pour money into Latin America to develop it and so on and so forth. There's none of this going on. It's all about security, you know, and do what you're told or else kind of stuff. Whilst the Chinese, on the other hand, are sort of thinking in economic terms, in terms of trade, in terms of investment. So for me, it's all stick and no carrot. And it's a way of sort of Southcom being very present in various Latin American states. My country, Ecuador, is a good example. Venezuela is another good example. But with no real, apparent, real goal to put an end to the drugs trade. So if you think of Venezuela, actually, Venezuela is a marginal exporter of, all the experts agree that Venezuela is a marginal exporter of cocaine to the United States. It's not where the cocaine is coming from. The cocaine is coming from the Pacific coast of South America right now, including from my country, Ecuador, where most of the cocaine is coming through Ecuadorian ports. It's not on those little dingy boats, the speedboats. It's on in massive
for sure.
containers.
But President Trump would say to you, I believe, but these cartels have carried out murders. They're engaged in narco-terrorism. It's not the amount of drugs on the boat, it's the amount of killers on the boat. And we're trying to stop a global escalation of death and destruction. That would be, I think, what the Trump administration would say. What would you say back?
But that has been a failure since the 1980s, since Ronald Reagan declared war on drugs, and with exactly the same logic and exactly the same rationale. Then in the 1990s with Plan Colombia, which failed miserably, Colombia's back with peak levels of cocaine. Actually, interestingly, it's fascinating because a lot of this cocaine is not going to the United States anymore. It's going to Europe. And the big drugs crisis in the United States, and cocaine is a problem, obviously, but the big drugs crisis in the United States is the opioid crisis, it's fentanyl, which has nothing to do with Venezuela. Nobody, not even the Trump administration, is accusing Venezuela of exporting fentanyl. So it's kind of, it feels like domestic politics. It feels like bombastic, Trump-like policies. And actually, to be honest, I think what's behind this agenda is Rubio's regime change agenda. And, you know, ultimately, the Venezuelan government has been very resilient to all these attempts. I would argue that US attempts to topple the Venezuelan government have failed because they've created a siege mentality and they've created a kind of a security state. And the more the US kind of tries to strangle Venezuela, the more the government seems to find ways to be more resilient. The US is still talking to the more radical actors within Venezuela. So it's talking to the kind of far right of Venezuela instead of talking to some other right-wing actors who are actually against the possibility of US strikes or US regime change. So it's still kind of, the whole US policy towards Venezuela seems to me to be very misguided. It's unlikely to lead to regime change. It's not where the drugs are coming from. The drugs are in containers, in actually banana boxes that are coming from the Ecuadorian coast. That's where the bulk of it is. So it seems to be for show and not really a serious policy. But the risk the consequence of this show could be absolutely disastrous for Venezuela and could lead to another refugee crisis like the one we saw with sanctions. I mean, if it was bad with sanctions, you can imagine what it would be with war.
Absolutely. Before we go, let's turn to Ecuador, where, again, you served as foreign minister under former President Rafael Correa. The country is now being called the world's newest narco state and just experienced the most violent 7 months in a decade. Ecuadorian President Noboa has deployed the military to the streets, turned to the Trump administration for help, and even put the idea of allowing a U.S. military base on Ecuadorian territory to a national referendum. Just this month, U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio pledged millions to support him. What do you make of this deeper U.S. involvement in Ecuador? What do you think the U.S.'s motives are?
Ecuador is a tragedy. In the last 8 years, we've seen a terrible, terrible decline, one of the most dramatic security declines in peacetime. In 2017, where the government I served ended, you had 5 homicides per 100,000 inhabitants, one of the lowest homicide rates in Latin America, 5 homicides per 100,000 inhabitants. Today, if the trend continues, 2025, we'll have 50 homicides per 100,000 inhabitants. Wow. That's 10 times more. This is the highest growth of homicide rate in peacetime, as far as I know, certainly in Latin America, and we'd have to look at data beyond, but as far as I know, in human history, in peacetime. So it's a disaster. And yet, this security decline, this crumbling, this kind of, this failed state has been accompanied over the last 7 years, certainly since 2018, by closer US-Ecuador security cooperation. So the US has been more and more involved, the US has been more and more present, the US has been present in the Galapagos Islands now, with presence with an airfield that they're running there. You have 2 SOFAs that have been passed by Congress, which is these agreements to have actually more security cooperation and potential boots on the ground as well. They're not yet that, but the SOFAs open the possibility for that to happen. The FBI is there. I mean, Ecuador-US security, anti-narcotics cooperation is at its peak. And as you said, there's now talk of having a US military base, which is illegal in the current Ecuadorian constitution, which is why the government wants to do this referendum to be able to reform the constitution to allow for the US military base to be back. Ecuador had a US military base years ago. And again, we had higher homicide rates and higher drug export rates and a bigger problem with narcotics when the US were there than when the US were not there. I'm not saying it's the US's fault. I don't think we should correlate it that way. But what I'm saying is that the US has failed to reduce the problem. And I think, again, it's the logic of the militarization of the war on drugs, not understanding that if you want to fight the cartels, if you want to fight the gangs, what you need is a solid state. You need a state that has institutional capacity, that has good, poverty reduction programs, that has employment so that these youth don't join the gangs and don't join the cartels, that is functioning, that has a functioning armed force, a functioning police force, but also a functioning security service or intelligence service, so that it's functioning across the board, with both a social arm and a security arm. And what we've seen in the last few years is the advent of a failed state where everything crumbles, where poverty has been on the rise, inequality has been on the rise, the police are not well equipped anymore, the military is not well equipped anymore. There are huge swaths of Ecuadorian territory that have been abandoned by the Ecuadorian state. And no amount of cooperation with the United States is going to compensate for a failed state.
Which is why you use the word tragedy. So we've talked about Latin America, the Middle East, and the Global South at large. With Israel's ongoing genocide in Gaza and Trump's second term showing really an even more aggressive imperial posture, do you think we've reached a moment where the masks are off? Are we at a point where the world finally sees things as they are? And if so, could there be an opening for change?
I think that's absolutely right. The mask is off. I mean, for some of us, it was never fully on. So, some of us would argue that we could see through it. But I think for the bulk of the population, the world population, the mask is off. I would say the West, which is a very generic term, but was sort of this, you always constantly using this kind of moral pedestal, defending human rights and democracy and rule of, and they were a force for stability and good in the world and so on and so forth. Okay, well, I would argue there were major holes in that and major problems with that, but really, I think what we're seeing today is the crumbling of that legitimacy, the crumbling of that credibility. And I think Gaza is evidently at the center of it. A number of Western countries have spat on human rights. They've completely ignored their obligations under international law, and they've shown that human rights is essentially something that they weaponize. That they weaponize when it's against an enemy, when it's someone they don't like, when it's a regime they don't like, when it's a government they don't like. But it's something that they conveniently ignore when it's perceived as going against their national interest or being basically, when it's a government, a regime they endorse, no matter the level of human rights violations, they will run with it. So I think, and if you look at the level of global protest and disgruntlement in a number, including in global north countries and Western advanced economies, I think, you're right, the mask is off, and we're seeing a big movement of social and political and civil discontent in several parts of the world because the mask is off, and because a lot of particularly young people are seeing that this is hypocritical, this is double standards, this is not how things should be run.
Guillaume Long, thank you so much for joining us on UpFront.
Thank you very much for having me on the show.